Happy birthday, Mom! My son, Jamie, exclaimed with a bright smile, holding out a beautiful bouquet of flowers. My husband, Oliver, stood beside him, grinning broadly, as if the world were perfect in the sunny Saturday morning light. Their words should have made me feel overjoyed, but instead, a heavy, uneasy feeling took over me. This moment, as precious as it was supposed to be, only made me feel more detached. I didn't expect to feel this way. 5 years. That's how long it had been since we got married. Those 5 years felt like a dream at first. Simple, ordinary, but filled with happiness. Despite Oliver's increasingly demanding job, we'd found a rhythm, and I had taken pride in managing our home and raising our son on my own. My job as a nail artist, working out of a small studio in our house, kept me busy, but I cherished the balance we had. Jamie was 4 now, and our weekends were sacred. Oliver, a company employee, always made time for us then, taking us to amusement parks or out on picnics. It seemed we had everything: happiness, stability, and laughter. But beneath the surface, the foundation had begun to crumble, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started. "Olivia, I'll be home late today," Oliver called out one morning as he grabbed his jacket from the hook near the door. "Another late night? You've been working a lot lately," I said, a tinge of disappointment creeping into my voice. "Yeah, there's a lot going on. New clients, training the new recruits, and next week, I'll have a business trip. So don't wait up." I stood in the doorway, watching him rush off, already consumed by work before the day had even begun. In the past few months, our time together had dwindled. His job had grown more demanding, with long hours, overnight business trips, and late-night returns becoming the norm. It wasn't just the workload that had increased. It was the distance between us. I felt like I was losing him, and it was confusing because I knew he loved us. Or at least, I thought he did. That morning, after Oliver left, I found myself sitting down, mentally going over the bills and household finances. I sighed. Money had become tight. His explanation for the sudden change in our finances didn't sit well with me. According to him, his company had changed their policies and no longer reimbursed for business trips. At the same time, our out-of-pocket expenses had ballooned. Between his social obligations and other things he couldn't fully explain, it felt like we were constantly bleeding money. We worked so hard, but the more we earned, the less we seemed to have. I tried to bring it up gently, suggesting we be more careful with spending, but Oliver was quick to brush off my concerns. "It's just how it is, Liv," he said, sounding exasperated. "You need to understand, this is part of the job. We're supposed to support each other, right?" I nodded, but his words left a bitter taste in my mouth. Support. Wasn't that what I had been doing all this time? Managing our home, raising our son, handling our finances? As much as I tried to convince myself that this was just a phase, that we would get through it, something didn't feel right. Still, I chose to stay silent, hoping it would pass. Weeks passed, and Oliver's absences became a regular part of our lives. "Since you're handling everything during the week," he said one evening, "I'll take Jamie out on the weekend so you can have a break." At first, I was grateful. The free time gave me space to relax, catch up on my work, and even spend a few hours just being by myself. But after a while, his offer started to feel more like an excuse. Every Saturday, he took Jamie out somewhere, just the two of them. I started feeling left out. "How about the 3 of us go somewhere next weekend?" I suggested one evening, hoping to reconnect with him. "No, Liv, that won't work," he replied, avoiding my eyes. "Work's about to get even crazier, and this is the only way I can make time for Jamie." "Even so, I don't want to spend weekends alone all the time," I said, feeling vulnerable. He laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "That's a luxury problem, don't you think? You've been saying how much you need rest. I'm giving it to you. Stop worrying and enjoy it." There was something in the way he said it that stung. It didn't feel like concern. It felt like he didn't want me there. What was he hiding? As time went on, I began to feel more uneasy. His refusal to include me on these outings didn't make sense, and he still wasn't helping with household chores. Whenever I gently brought it up, he would brush it off, making me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. Then, one Saturday, everything changed. It was a warm day, and as usual, Oliver had taken Jamie out while I stayed home. I was trying to distract myself, flipping through channels on the TV, when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Anderson, a loyal client of mine. She had been coming to me for years, ever since I first started as a nail artist. We had grown close over time, more like friends than just a client and nail tech. She was in her early 40s, with a kind, wise demeanor that I had always admired. "Olivia, do you have any plans today?" she asked. "Not really," I said, my mood lifting a little at the sound of her voice. "It's last minute, but I've got an event tomorrow and I'd love to get my nails done. Could you come over?" "Of course," I replied, glad for the distraction. I quickly gathered my tools, jumped into the car, and headed toward her apartment building. On the way, I thought about how much I enjoyed working with Mrs. Anderson. Her warm presence always made me feel at ease, and her appreciation for my work made every session enjoyable. But as I stepped out of the car and headed toward the entrance of her apartment building, something caught my attention. I heard cheerful voices coming from a nearby park, and when I turned to look, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Their comma across the street were Oliver and Jamie, laughing together with a woman I didn't recognize. Jamie was holding out a bouquet of flowers to her, saying, "Happy birthday, Mom." My heart stopped as I watched her smile warmly and pat his head like she was his mother. Oliver stood beside them, watching proudly, not making any move to correct what Jamie had just said. My mind went blank. How could this be happening? Why would Jamie call her Mom? I tried to make sense of it, but the pieces fit together in the most devastating way. Oliver's increased work hours, the money problems, his refusal to include me in their outings, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. This woman was his affair partner, and Jamie had been drawn into their lie. A part of me remained oddly calm as I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of them together. I had the evidence now, but my heart was breaking. I continued to Mrs. Anderson's apartment in a daze. How was I supposed to act normal after seeing that? Yet I couldn't let my emotions affect my work. When I arrived, Mrs. Anderson immediately noticed something was wrong. "Olivia, you seem off today," she said as soon as I started setting up. "Is everything all right?" At that, I couldn't hold it in anymore. Tears welled up in my eyes, and before I knew it, I was telling her everything. About the woman, about Jamie, and about how betrayed I felt. She listened quietly, her eyes wide with surprise, and when I was done, she said, "I'm so sorry, Olivia. You don't deserve this, but you need to think carefully about what to do next." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. What would I do next? How could I possibly confront Oliver after what I had just seen? In the days following that awful Saturday, I couldn't shake the image of Oliver, Jamie, and the woman from my mind. My body moved through the motions of daily life, but my thoughts were trapped, spinning endlessly around that moment in the park. How could Oliver betray me like this? And how long had this been going on? The questions gnawed at me, keeping me awake at night. I knew I couldn't let this continue. But where would I even begin? The thought of confronting Oliver made me feel sick to my stomach. He had always been so convincing, so good at making me feel like I was the one overreacting or misunderstanding things. I wasn't sure I could face him without breaking down, but I also knew I needed to protect Jamie. The idea that Oliver had dragged him into this, that Jamie was being forced to call another woman Mom, filled me with rage. I had to do something. It was a few days later, on a quiet Tuesday evening, that I received an unexpected message from Mrs. Anderson. She had been thinking about my situation and suggested a plan, something I had never imagined doing, but that suddenly made sense. "Olivia, if you're serious about confronting Oliver, you need more than just a confrontation. You need to expose the truth in a way he can't deny," she said when I met her for coffee that evening. Her suggestion was bold. She recommended that I gather concrete evidence, confront Oliver when he least expected it, and ensure there were no loopholes he could slip through. Mrs. Anderson even offered to help me. She explained that, based on my description of the woman from the park, she might know exactly who she was. "I think she lives next door to me," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. This revelation made everything feel more real. If Mrs. Anderson was right, then the woman Oliver had been seeing wasn't just a random person. She was someone living practically under my nose, someone whose presence I had never suspected. And so, with Mrs. Anderson's help, I began to piece together a plan. I wasn't going to storm into a confrontation half-cocked. I wanted to make sure Oliver had no choice but to admit what he had done. The following weekend arrived like a ticking clock. My nerves were on edge as Oliver and Jamie prepared to head out for their usual Saturday excursion. It was all I could do to keep my voice steady as I asked, "Where are you two going today?" Oliver barely glanced at me. "Just to the park again. I told you, Liv, I want Jamie to get some fresh air." "Wouldn't it be nice if we went together? As a family?" I asked, though I already knew what his response would be. "Liv, you know I've been busy. This is time for Jamie and me. You should enjoy your break," he said with that dismissive tone that had started to feel all too familiar. As they left, I felt my chest tighten with a mix of anger and helplessness. I wanted to scream, to tell him I knew exactly what was going on, but instead, I waited. Mrs. Anderson had called earlier to tell me that her neighbor, the same woman I had seen in the park, had company over, and that she suspected it was Oliver. This was my moment. After they left, I grabbed my car keys and drove over to Mrs. Anderson's apartment. My hands were shaking as I parked and made my way to the entrance. I didn't know what I was expecting. Part of me was still holding on to some tiny shred of hope that this was all a misunderstanding, but it wasn't. As I stood outside Mrs. Anderson's door, I heard them, Oliver's unmistakable voice and Jamie's laugh. They were in the apartment next door. I had seen them together before, but hearing them through that door, knowing they were inside with her, was like a knife to my chest. Mrs. Anderson opened her door and gave me a comforting nod. She had been a rock through this, standing by me when I felt like my world was crumbling. She handed me her phone. "I recorded the noise they've been making," she said. "In case you need proof. It's clear they've been here before." I felt numb. My body moved on autopilot as we both stepped outside and waited for Oliver to appear. I wasn't going to ambush them inside. I wanted to confront them in broad daylight, where there would be no hiding. It didn't take long. Maybe 15 minutes passed before the door to the neighboring apartment swung open, and there they were. Oliver, Jamie, and the woman I now knew was named Sarah. She looked exactly as she had in the park, with her perfectly styled hair and that overly sweet smile. Jamie was holding her hand. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Oliver froze, his hand still on the door handle, his face an unreadable mix of shock and guilt. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw me standing there with Mrs. Anderson. "Olivia? What are you doing here?" Oliver stammered, his voice barely concealing his panic. "That's my question," I replied, my voice trembling. "Aren't you supposed to be on a business trip today? And who is she?" I nodded toward Sarah, whose face had gone pale. She looked defiant, but there was fear in her eyes. Oliver was quick to lie. She's just a coworker. We were working on something." "Really? Is that why Jamie's calling her mom now?" I spat, my anger finally boiling over. "You think I haven't noticed what's been going on? The business trips that don't exist, the missing money, the weekends where you keep me out of the picture?" For a moment, Oliver looked like he might deny it all. But the evidence was too overwhelming. I reached into my bag and pulled out the photos I had taken of them in the park, showing them to Mrs. Anderson for good measure. Her gasp confirmed what I already knew. "That woman is my neighbor," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "I never imagined." The truth was undeniable now. I had all the proof I needed, and Oliver knew it. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked like he might try to plead with me. But then he straightened up, his face hardening into defiance. "So what?" he said, his voice cold. "What do you want, Liv? A divorce? Fine, we'll get divorced. But Jamie's coming with me. He already likes Sarah more than you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. How could he stand there and talk about our son like he was some kind of prize in a game? How could he think I would ever let him take Jamie away from me? "You think Jamie's going to choose you?" I asked, my voice shaking with fury. "You don't know him at all, do you? He hates going with you on these trips. He doesn't want to call her mom." "He's been miserable, but you've been too wrapped up in your own selfishness to notice." Oliver's face contorted with anger, but I didn't back down. I had spent too long letting him push me aside, making me feel like I was the problem. Not anymore. I'm going to get full custody, I said, my voice steady now. You've been lying to both of us for months. You've hurt Jamie, and you've hurt me, and you're going to pay for that. Mrs. Anderson stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Oliver. And I'll be more than happy to testify on her behalf. I've heard everything that's been going on in that apartment. You've made my life a nightmare with your cheating. Oliver's mouth fell open, but no words came out. He had been caught, and there was no escape now. As I stood there, watching the man I had once loved crumble in front of me, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. The lies, the betrayal, the uncertainty, it was all out in the open now. I could finally move on. After that explosive confrontation, everything seemed to unravel quickly. The next few days were a blur of emotions and practicalities as I started to navigate the storm I had found myself in. My mind swung wildly between disbelief, anger, and an overwhelming sadness for Jamie. I had no choice but to act fast, to secure our future and protect him from the fallout of Oliver's betrayal. I spent the following week meeting with a lawyer, gathering more evidence, and setting things in motion for the divorce. Thankfully, Mrs. Anderson had been a steady presence by my side, offering both emotional and practical support. She introduced me to her lawyer, who was sharp and direct. Exactly the type of person I needed to fight this battle. Oliver, on the other hand, had withdrawn into himself. He spent the next few nights on the couch trying to avoid any confrontation with me, but I could tell he was still trying to figure out a way to win, especially when it came to Jamie. His words from that day haunted me. Jamie's coming with me. He already likes Sarah more than you. Those words weren't just cruel, they were delusional. Jamie wasn't some pawn to be manipulated. He was a sensitive boy, and although he loved spending time with his dad, I knew the confusion Oliver had caused in his life was hurting him. One evening, when Oliver was out, I sat down with Jamie, who had been playing with his toys quietly in the living room. "Hey, buddy," I said gently, sitting down next to him. "Can we talk for a minute?" Jamie looked up at me, his big brown eyes full of curiosity and a little worry. "Okay, Mommy." I took a deep breath, unsure of how much he understood about what was happening. "You know how you've been spending a lot of time with Daddy and that lady, right?" His face scrunched up, and he nodded slowly. "Yeah. Daddy says she's nice." "How do you feel about that?" I asked, my heart breaking as I saw the confusion on his face. "I don't like calling her Mom," Jamie whispered, looking down at the floor. "I don't wanna. You're my mom." Tears stung my eyes, but I held them back. "You never have to call her that, sweetheart. You don't have to do anything that makes you uncomfortable." He nodded again, and I hugged him tightly, feeling a fierce determination rise up inside me. Whatever Oliver had been trying to do, whatever manipulative games he was playing with Jamie's feelings, were about to end. A few days later, I found myself standing outside Oliver's office building, waiting in the cold autumn air. I had decided to confront him one last time, this time not out of anger, but out of necessity. It wasn't just about the divorce or custody anymore. It was about facing the reality of what our lives had become and ensuring Jamie's well-being above all else. When Oliver finally emerged, he was caught off guard by my presence. He approached me with a tense expression, clearly not in the mood for another confrontation. "Liv, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. "I need to talk to you," I said, standing my ground. "We need to talk about Jamie." His shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded. "All right, let's walk." We walked in silence for a while before I finally spoke. "What are you trying to do, Oliver? Why are you trying to take Jamie away from me? Do you really think this is what's best for him?" Oliver looked down at the sidewalk, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "I don't want to take him away from you, Liv. I don't know. I thought maybe he'd be better off with me, with Sarah." I stopped walking and turned to face him. "Better off with you and the woman you've been cheating on me with? Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds?" He winced, but I didn't let up. "You've been lying to me for months. You dragged Jamie into this mess, and now you want to uproot his entire life because you're chasing some fantasy with Sarah? This isn't about what's best for him. It's about you, Oliver. It's always been about you." For a moment, Oliver looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped. "I don't know, Liv. I screwed up. I know that. I thought maybe Jamie would be happier." "Do you even know how Jamie feels?" I asked, my voice softening slightly. "He's confused, Oliver. He's been forced into a situation he doesn't understand, and he's hurting because of it." Oliver looked away, guilt flickering across his face. "I didn't mean for it to be like this." "But it is," I said firmly, "and now we have to deal with it. The only thing that matters now is what's best for Jamie. We need to stop thinking about ourselves and start thinking about him." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the ground. For the first time in months, I saw a hint of the man I used to know, the man who cared deeply about his family. But it was too late for us. Too much had been broken, and I couldn't trust him anymore. A week later, we found ourselves sitting in the lawyer's office, hammering out the details of the divorce. It was a tense, uncomfortable meeting, but it was necessary. My lawyer, sharp and no-nonsense, ensured that every detail was accounted for, especially when it came to Jamie's custody. In the end, I was awarded full custody, with Oliver receiving visitation rights. I had insisted on this after learning just how much emotional turmoil Jamie had been put through during Oliver's relationship with Sarah. Oliver agreed, albeit reluctantly, and as we signed the final documents, there was a strange sense of finality. I had spent years building a life with this man, only for it to end in betrayal and heartbreak. But now, sitting across from him in that sterile lawyer's office, I felt a sense of relief. I was finally free to rebuild my life, free from the lies and deceit that had poisoned our marriage. After the meeting, Oliver pulled me aside, his face filled with regret. "Liv, I'm sorry. For everything." I looked at him, feeling a strange mixture of anger and sadness. "I know, Oliver, but sorry doesn't fix this. We have to move on. For Jamie's sake." He nodded, his eyes downcast. "I'll be better for him. I promise." I hoped he would. For Jamie's sake, I truly hoped he would. Life after the divorce was an adjustment, but slowly Jamie and I began to find our new normal. I moved back in with my parents for a while, which was a blessing. They adored Jamie and gave us the space and support we needed to heal. My nail business continued to thrive, thanks in no small part to loyal clients like Mrs. Anderson, who continued to be a source of comfort and strength. Jamie, though still young, seemed to adapt better than I had expected. He missed his dad, of course, but with the stability of my parents' home and the love surrounding him, he started to come out of his shell again. We spent more time together, just the two of us, rebuilding our bond. One evening, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with his big brown eyes and asked, "Mom, are you happy now?" His question took me by surprise, and I had to swallow the lump in my throat before answering. "I'm getting there, sweetheart. We're going to be just fine." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Jamie and I would be just fine. We were finally free to create a life filled with honesty, love, and happiness. On our terms. The months following the divorce passed in a kind of peaceful blur. It wasn't easy, but with each day, life began to feel more manageable, even hopeful. Jamie and I had settled into a comfortable routine at my parents' house, and my nail business was thriving, allowing me to focus on rebuilding our lives. There were moments when the weight of everything, Oliver's betrayal, the sudden shift in my life, still caught me off guard. But I had learned to breathe through it and keep moving forward. One sunny afternoon, I found myself sitting in the backyard of my parents' home, watching Jamie play with my father. The sight of them laughing together filled me with a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. My mother was in the kitchen, baking one of her famous pies, and for the first time in months, I felt an overwhelming sense of safety and warmth. "Liv, why don't you come play with us?" Jamie called out, waving a small football in the air. I smiled, shaking my head. "You two look like you've got it covered." "Come on, Mom. You can be on Grandpa's team," Jamie insisted, his eyes sparkling with excitement. Laughing, I stood up and joined them, marveling at how far we had come in such a short time. My parents had been incredible, supporting us through the most difficult time in my life without a single word of judgment. They had welcomed Jamie and me with open arms, making their home a safe haven when everything else had fallen apart. As we played, my phone buzzed on the patio table, and I glanced at it. It was a message from Oliver. I hadn't heard from him in over a week, and seeing his name brought a mix of emotions. Can I talk to you? About Jamie. I sighed, feeling the familiar heaviness in my chest whenever I had to deal with him. Though we were officially divorced, Oliver still had visitation rights and tried to stay involved in Jamie's life. I had to admit, he had been more attentive since the divorce, but there were still moments where I questioned his motivations. I sent him a brief reply. Okay, let's meet tomorrow after Jamie goes to bed. That night, after Jamie had fallen asleep, I found myself waiting for Oliver's call. The house was quiet, with only the distant hum of my parents' television downstairs. I didn't know what to expect from the conversation, if it would be another argument or a genuine discussion about our son. Finally, the phone rang. Hey, Oliver's voice came through, soft and cautious. Hey, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. What's going on? I've been thinking, he began slowly. I want to talk about Jamie's future. I know I haven't been the best father, and I know things have been really hard, but I want to do better. For him. There was a pause as I let his words sink in. I wasn't sure if I believed him yet, but the fact that he was saying it at all felt like a step in the right direction. I've been spending a lot of time reflecting on everything that's happened, Oliver continued. I realize now how much I hurt you and Jamie, and I don't want to make things worse. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. But actions speak louder than words, Oliver. It's not enough to just say you'll do better. You have to actually do it. I know, he said, sounding defeated. And I'm trying. I've started going to therapy and I've cut things off with Sarah. That last part surprised me. I hadn't expected him to end things with her. Maybe a part of me had assumed they would stay together now that everything was out in the open. Really? I asked, not quite able to hide my disbelief. Yeah, he admitted. It wasn't right. I thought I was in love with her, but it was more about escaping than anything real. I know I made a lot of mistakes, Liv, but I don't want to lose Jamie. He's the most important thing in my life. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Hearing him talk like this was unexpected, and it stirred a mix of emotions in me. I didn't want to get my hopes up, but at the same time, I wanted to believe that Oliver could change for Jamie's sake. I want Jamie to have a good relationship with you, Oliver, I said slowly, but that can only happen if you're consistent. If you really show up for him and don't disappear when things get tough, you've got to prove that to both of us. I will, he promised. I know I've lost your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm going to be better for Jamie. He deserves that. We ended the call on a tentative note of understanding. I wasn't ready to fully trust Oliver yet, but I was willing to give him a chance to prove himself. For Jamie's sake, I hoped he would follow through this time. Over the next few months, Oliver made a noticeable effort to stay involved in Jamie's life. He showed up for every visitation on time, and though things between us were still strained, we managed to communicate civilly. Jamie seemed to enjoy spending time with his dad, though it took a while for the tension to fade. During this time, I also began to rebuild my life in ways I hadn't expected. My nail business continued to grow, and I eventually opened a small, cozy studio in town. Mrs. Anderson, true to her word, remained a loyal client and a close friend. She even brought in new clients, helping me expand my business beyond anything I'd imagined. My relationship with Jamie grew stronger too. Without the constant stress of my crumbling marriage, I was able to focus on him in ways I hadn't before. We spent more time together, going on small adventures and enjoying the simplicity of our new life. Watching him laugh and play, I felt a deep sense of pride and joy. He was thriving, and so was I. One evening, as Jamie and I sat on the couch watching a movie, he turned to me and said, "Mom, I love spending time with you." I smiled and ruffled his hair. "I love spending time with you too, buddy. Are we happy now?" he asked, echoing a question he had asked me months ago. This time, my answer came without hesitation. "Yes, Jamie, We're happy. And I meant it. For the first time in a long while, I felt a deep sense of peace. The chaos, the heartache, and the betrayal that had once consumed my life were now distant memories. Oliver had made his mistakes, but he was trying to make amends, and I had built a life for Jamie and me that was full of love, stability, and hope. As I tucked Jamie into bed that night, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Life hadn't turned out the way I had planned, but in many ways, it was better. I had learned that happiness wasn't about perfection or control. It was about resilience, love, and the ability to move forward, no matter how hard the journey had been. A year after the divorce, on Jamie's 5th birthday, I threw a small party at my new studio. My parents, Mrs. Anderson, and a few close friends gathered to celebrate. Oliver even showed up, quietly joining in the festivities. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just a shared sense of joy as we all watched Jamie blow out his candles with a wide, excited grin. As I looked around the room, at the people who had supported me through the hardest time in my life, I realized how lucky I was. I had a community of love around me, and Jamie and I were surrounded by people who cared. That night, as I cleaned up after the party and put Jamie to bed, I sat down with a cup of tea, reflecting on everything that had happened in the past year. The pain, the heartbreak, the rebuilding. It had all led me to this moment of peace. I wasn't the same person I had been before, but I was stronger, wiser, and more determined to build a life full of joy for both Jamie and me, and I knew, no matter what came next, we would be just fine.